My book today is called Eddie's World of Shapes. Story and pictures by Mrs. Vegan. So, once in a while, Eddie, I'd like for you to pick up your toys without me having to tell you, said Eddie's mother. But I did, Mom, replied Eddie. Then what is that big box doing on the front porch? I don't know, Mom. It looks like it has my name on it, but I've never seen it before. Eddie was curious. I wonder what it is, he thought. Eddie had more toys than he knew what to do with. His mom was always after him to pick them up. She was still talking as she drove into the driveway. Eddie didn't hear a word she said. He was too busy thinking about the box on the porch. What could it be, he thought to himself, and who put it there? Eddie knew that the box was for him since it had his name on it in big black letters. As soon as the car came to a stop, Eddie jumped out and ran as fast as he could to the front porch. What do you think it is, Mom? Yelled Eddie as he began to dig into the box. Oh, wow, screamed Eddie. There must be hundreds of them. What is it? asked Eddie's mom. Shapes, Eddie said in amazement. All kinds of shapes. Eddie's grandpa gave him the box of shapes. He knew how much Eddie liked to create things. He wanted the shapes to be a surprise. Robbie and Rachel lived in the house next to Eddie's. They came running over to see what all the excitement was about. Hi, Eddie, yelled Robbie. What's in the box? Questioned Rachel. Shapes, answered Eddie. Lots of them. More shapes than I've ever seen before. You mean shapes like circles, squares, and triangles? Questioned Rachel. Yes, but how did you know about shapes? Asked Eddie. Rachel told Eddie and Robbie that she had learned all the names of shapes in school. Her art teacher even let her cut the shapes out of colorful paper. Just then, Eddie's grandpa drove up in his big truck. Grandpa, yelled Eddie, look what I have. Eddie's grandpa walked over to the box of shapes, reached into the box. He took out a large triangle. He held it up and asked Eddie what he planned to do with his shapes. Eddie thought hard and said, I'm not sure yet, but I'll think of something. And Rachel spoke up and said, I know. Maybe Eddie can build something with his shapes. They all looked in the box trying to figure out what in the world to do with them. Eddie's grandpa started walking back toward his truck. I have to get back to work, he said. I'll see you kids later. And just before he got back into his truck, he turned to Eddie and said, Hey, Eddie, why don't you create a world? A world? Questioned Eddie. How can I create a world with shapes? Eddie's grandpa told him that everything around him was made of shapes, and if he looked really close, he could see them. Eddie's grandpa told him that his truck was made out of circles and rectangles. Eddie squinted his eyes and looked closely as the truck drove away. I can see them, he yelled. Me too, said Rachel. Well, I can't see circles and triangles on that truck, snapped Robbie. Robbie walked over and stood next to Eddie. He whispered into his ear, You can't create a world out of shapes, Eddie. It won't work. Eddie looked at Robbie and said, If my grandpa said it'll work, then I know it will work. Not this time, said Robbie. We have to go now, announced Rachel. I hear my mom calling. See you later. Yeah, bye, Eddie, snickered Robbie. Good luck building your world out of the shapes. You can do it, yelled Rachel from across the yard. See you tomorrow. Eddie sat alone thinking about what his grandpa had told him. He said, Eddie, everything is made out of shapes. If you look real close, you can see them. And Eddie wanted to prove his friend Robbie that his grandpa was right. So he decided to give it a try. Eddie was going to create a world of shapes. Eddie loaded his box of shapes into his wagon. He went into the backyard and got his dog Rusty. Together they walked to a giant field where there was nothing but grass. Eddie opened his box of shapes, took them out, and started moving them around the field. And Rusty sat and watched as Eddie rearranged his shapes. He would put shapes in front of others. Some shapes were laying flat on the ground. Some shapes were even on top of others. Eddie was surprised at all the different shapes he had. There were circles and triangles and ovals and diamonds and squares. They were all different sizes, too. When he set them next to each other, he could see that he had small, medium, and large sizes of every shape. All of a sudden, Eddie heard a horn. "Hey, Eddie," yelled his grandpa. "I thought you might be needing more shapes, so I brought you a truckload." "Wow," Eddie said quietly to himself. "Now I have enough shapes to fill this whole field." The shapes were unloaded into a huge pile. As the truck drove away, Eddie yelled in his loudest voice, Thank you, Grandpa. Thank you so much." He waved as his grandpa drove away. "Come on, Rusty," Eddie said to his dog. "We have work to do." And Eddie worked all day and all night. He created trucks and trees and buildings. He even figured out how to make people and animals out of shapes. Eddie was very proud of himself. He was happy that he was able to build a pretend world out of shapes. That next morning, while Robbie was getting dressed in his bedroom, he happened to glance out of his window. He noticed that the field of grass across from Eddie's house was now filled with trees, buildings, and trucks and people. They were brightly colored and everything was made out of shapes. He couldn't believe it. He rubbed his eyes and looked again. Robbie could see circles, triangles, rectangles, ovals, diamonds, and squares in all different sizes. Just then, his sister Rachel came running into his room shouting, Hurry up! Hurry up! Let's go!" Rachel ran outside yelling, "Isn't it beautiful? So many colors and so many shapes." Rachel was excited to see what a wonderful world that Eddie had created. She was jumping and skipping. When Robbie finally caught up with his sister, he looked at her and said, "Wow, Eddie really did create a world of shapes." And Rachel was staring at Eddie's world as she whispered to herself, "I knew he could do it." The end. That's Eddie's World of Shapes, written and illustrated by Mrs. Vegan.